The Holy Gospel for the day is taken from the 12th chapter of the Gospel according to St. Luke. And I do invite you to just listen to this very familiar story. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to him, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I'll do this. I'll pull down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you've ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things that you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. Let us pray for the blessing of the Spirit to anoint the word. Come, Holy Spirit, and settle over us. Come, Spirit, that our hearts would be open. Make a place in us to truly hear you today. Speak, Lord, and let us listen. Amen. I don't know if it's a true story or not, but the story is told that one day Jack Benny and George Burns, two of the world's most famous comedians, had lunch with Edgar Bergen, who is probably one of the world's most famous ventriloquists. And you probably already know that Jack Benny was known to be sort of miserly tight with his money. And so that's why it was so surprising that when it was time to pay the bill, Benny asked for the check. And after they were leaving, George Burns says to him, "That was really nice of you to ask for the check." And Jack Benny said, "I didn't ask for the check, and that's the last time I'm ever going to have lunch with a ventriloquist." In his book, Life and Death Advice, Haddon Robinson tells a story. It's a parable, really, a fable. The story is that a man got up one day and he opened up the newspaper and he noticed that the date was 6 months in the future. And as he read, he thought, "Oh, this is really wonderful. I can make so much money at this." So he went to the sports page and he found where there was a horse that was against long odds was the winner, and he thought, "I can go there and bet on that horse and I'll win a lot of money." And then he looked at the stock report and he saw that there was a stock that today is very poor and in 6 months was going to be doing fine, and he would buy that stock while it was low and then it would really pay off, and he was just elated. He was just going through in his mind one thing after the other about ways that he could make money because he had this newspaper, and his head was just spinning with all these great ideas. And then he turned the page to the obituaries, and there was his picture and his story. And it changed everything. Because when he saw what was coming, that death was going to incurse in his life, it changed the way that he looked at wealth and the way that he looked at his priorities. About a year or so before my father died, he and I had a very moving conversation together. My dad had been living at the VA center in Hot Springs. He stayed the last 7 years of his life there after my mother died. And he was kind of lonely, and I think he was sort of looking back over his life. And we had this conversation in which he was lamenting that there wasn't going to be any money to give to us kids. My parents were pretty poor, and there wasn't going to be anything left that would come to any of us. And then he said, "I guess I don't have anything to show for my life." And I said, "No, Dad, you're wrong. You do. You have 5 children who love you and to whom you taught how to be decent, honest, loving adults." And that's a lot. In fact, that's a lot more than a lot of people have. Someone comes to Jesus and asked Jesus to be the arbiter of who will inherit money in the family. Now, the first thing you need to know is that that was not uncommon for rabbis of the time. Rabbis often were asked this question, who gets what money? I mean, that's a fairly common question. And Jesus takes the question seriously, but not from the perspective of who will get what, but rather as a way to teach everyone who's listening to him a very important and powerful and life-changing truth. He comes and tells this parable because he wants people to understand that your life does not consist of your possessions, that your life is not your wealth, that knowing and loving God is more important than anything that you could have or accumulate or hold in your hand. And that's why he tells this wonderful parable. And I happen to think that this is one of the most challenging parables in the New Testament. It's not challenging because it's hard to understand. In fact, there's no wiggle room in understanding it, and that's really what makes it challenging. It's challenging because when we take Jesus seriously and we listen to him and we try and understand what he's getting at, it really does invite us and seek for us to look at our own lives and ask ourselves questions about priorities and what we make important and what we put ourselves into. And so it challenges us from that perspective. This is the story. Jesus said that a man had a lot of land and it produced abundantly. Now, the first thing you need to know about that is that at the time of Jesus, it was only farming that was thought to be a legitimate way to get wealthy. They believed that if you were a tradesperson or you made your money in commerce or in the professions, there might have been some possibility that you didn't do things exactly the way you should have done. Maybe you were unfair to somebody. Maybe you charged somebody a little too much. Maybe you cheated someone. There's always just this little shadow cast on other ways of making money. But if you were a farmer and you had wealth from that, that was because God was blessing you. After all, you can't get a good crop if you don't have fertile soil and rain and sunshine and all of those at the right time and in the right amount. In other words, all things that God controls. You can't have any of that and have a good crop unless God has given it to you. And this means that anyone hearing Jesus tell this parable would have automatically known that what he was saying was God had blessed this man greatly. And that makes it even more challenging to understand why the man had so little concern for a God relationship. And add to that the fact that Jewish law had two things that you must do if you had been blessed with abundance. One was you had to thank God, and the other was that you had to be generous and share that with others who were less fortunate. And that could happen by way of taking care of widows or orphans or being generous with the poor who lived around you. Could be done a number of different ways, but it was expected under Jewish law. The problem for this guy is he's become so attached to the gift that he's forgotten to focus on the giver. He loves the gift more than the giver, and because that's true, he's not doing either of those things that the law calls on him to do. He's just focused on the gift. And the more and more he focuses on the gift instead of the giver, the less and less possible it gets for him to even pay attention to the giver. Now, I think that's sort of how we are sometimes in our lives. Don't you sometimes want something from God, so much so that you forget to ask something of God in your heart? You want something from God, so you forget to just want God? Well, the man goes on, and all this accumulation is around him, and he begins to worry about it. He begins to think of, how can I keep this stuff safe? And he starts to hoard. This also is like us, isn't it? I mean, when you have something other than God as the principal and most important thing in your life, whatever it might be, you begin to wonder if it's ever going to be enough. Will there be enough? What am I going to do to make it last? Or what am I going to do to prevent it from going away? How can I keep from preventing it from being lost? These kinds of questions come to us because when we have something other than God as the principal interest of our life, the most important thing, the thing to which we are most devoted, the thing to which we give ourselves over, if that's something other than God, we'll always have to worry about its permanency because there's no guarantee it'll always be there for us. And so we hoard. The man said, "What will I do? Where will I store my stuff?" And then he hits upon the idea, I know what I'll do. I'll tear down the old barns, which, who knows, maybe they were fascinating enough, but I'll tear down the old barns and build new barns. And so that's what he does. He begins to find new ways of safeguarding, and he starts to think that as soon as I have that, then everything will be fine, and I'll be safe, and I won't have to worry about this anymore. In other words, he's putting all of his trust and faith in having that stuff around no matter what. And soon enough, the barns are all built, and then he is self-satisfied. Did you hear it? He is so happy with himself. And now everything that he plans to do with the rest of his life is oriented to himself, not caring about anyone else. It's all about him. I'm going to eat, drink, and be merry. It's all about me. All about me. And what a temptation it is for us to be centered on ourselves. When we're not centered on God, it's hard for us to be centered on anyone but ourselves. But the problem is, he has a false god. And this false god has brought him to a place where he's caring more about the gift than the giver, and so he has lost sight of things that he needs to pay attention to. His self-centeredness has brought him to a place where he hasn't even made provisions to have an heir for all this stuff that he has. And in the end, his false god will fail him. Because every false god fails you at the point of your obituary. In the wonderful play written by Arthur Miller called Death of a Salesman, which was made into a powerfully acted movie in which Dustin Hoffman played the main character, Willie Loman. Willie Loman is this sort of tragic, pathetic character. He doesn't have a decent relationship with anyone. I mean, his whole relationship pattern is just textbook dysfunctional stuff. I mean, you could write books about people like that. I guess Arthur Miller did that. But everything about his life is dysfunctional. But in the end, the saddest piece of all of that is that he has a false god. And his false god is thinking that everyone loves him. He thinks he's going to be successful and wealthy because everyone loves him. His customers love him, his friends love him, his family loves him. And he keeps holding his hope for his future and his life on this idea that everyone loves him. And then at the end of the movie, there's this terribly tragic scene in which you see the family standing around the grave, and you have to ask yourself, where are all these people who love him? Where did they all go? Because the only people there are his wife, his 2 sons, all of whom have terribly dysfunctional relationships with him, and the neighbor who lived next door who was constantly bailing him out. In other words, his failed God left him alone at the grave, because false gods always fail you at your obituary. There's not one thing in which they have power over about death. And if you are holding on or loving anyone other than God, that's where you're going to eventually end up, alone at the graveside. So I suppose we could pretend that this parable doesn't relate to us. I mean, after all, nobody here won the lottery this week, right? Did anybody win the lottery? Anybody putting up a new barn behind their house? No. Or maybe we could sort of justify our desire to accumulate stuff unnecessarily by saying, I need it, or I worked hard, I deserve it. But maybe today it would be better for us just to let Jesus' question permeate our soul and listen to the question that he seeks for us to answer, to figure out and identify the things that we place into a place where only God should be, that we give more importance, that we allow to fill us with hope that's a false hope. Maybe we need to let these words of Jesus waft into our awareness so that we can answer that. Maybe we need these questions. What's your barn? What are you hoarding? What are you giving your time, energy, money, and best effort to? Really, what would you change in your life if you knew that 6 months from now somebody would be reading your obituary? Would you really rather have your child want you because they love you and they want to spend time with you and they want to learn the lessons of life from you, or because they want your money when you die? What is it that's capturing your attention and keeping you away from God? Those are the questions of this text, and they are good questions and challenging questions, because you see, Jesus poses them in order to help us understand what things are interfering with the way that God invites our lives to be. Because you see, Jesus wants more for us. Jesus wants more for you than an empty, unfulfilled life. And he wants more for you than a lonely, empty, unredeemed death. This is our God who desires only goodness for you. 200 years ago in Prussia, things were really, really desperate. The king at that time, Frederick William III, knew that things were desperate. The country had been at war for many years. Wars are expensive. The treasury was depleted. Everything needed to be fixed. It was just very difficult. There was no money to do anything. He didn't want to leave his people desolate. He didn't want to leave them hopeless, but he didn't know what to do. And finally, after much prayer, he hit upon the idea of inviting all the women in Prussia to bring their gold and silver jewelry to be melted down and placed into the treasury. And in exchange for that, he would give them a small cross that was made of either brass or iron. It wasn't very valuable, but it was going to be engraved with the words, "I traded gold for iron," and then the year 1813. Well, when the word went out, it was overwhelming. Everybody brought gold and silver jewelry. Just loads and loads of people brought it to replenish the coffers of the country. It was just overwhelming. Because you see, people loved the king and the country more than their stuff. Loved king and country more than their stuff. And in fact, in Prussia at that time, it became completely unfashionable to wear jewelry of any kind except that cross. And that is actually where the Order of the Iron Cross was founded, which was the members of which never wear any kind of decoration except that cross. You see, I think that's what Jesus is inviting us today. To make King, that is God, more important than any kind of stuff in our lives, than anything we could accumulate or hold in our hands or touch with our fingers. When God is the most important, that changes our lives. Because when we know and love God, we have life. We have life that is now, and we have life that is forever. That's the Lord's desire for you.